about growth. Before we start, I'm the Sunday morning preacher, which means welcome, and it means update on things that have happened, which I think Chad hit on some of the major things, the all-consuming thing that is Youth Camp this last week. Resounding success. I mean, it went so well. And I say that as someone who was only there for snippets of the day, but it was a really tremendous week, and it doesn't happen if the family here doesn't rally around and make it happen. So every one of us who was a part of that in chair moving, in food prepping, or in the real battle behind the scenes, prayer for the week, thank you very much for everything you did to make that week such a great, transformative, powerful week. Joshua, Kelsey, I have your charging cube. Don't let me for the fifth time leave you without giving it to you. All right, last thing. Summer series is happening tonight. It's been really good. I've really enjoyed the theme, the spiritual disciplines. I'll tell you one small way that I've been able to implement those, and that's the hope. This summer series, the whole build up and speaker selection, the hope is that we get some actionable, impactful disciplines, things that we can practice that will help us. One of the small ways that I've done that recently is the quiet time. Of course, I was the speaker who did Silence and Solitude, so it's cheating a little bit. I did a deep study and presented the lesson. But just finding time to have silence and quiet. And I've started doing that in the car with my kids. I set a timer. I set the timer up in front of them. We go 5 minutes with no talking. And I taught them how to do a breath prayer, which is a really fun thing. It's you say something on the way in and something on the way out for the whole 5 minutes. It has been lovely. In fact, I was talking to them about their daily rest time, which my kids are too old for naps. 2 of them are too old for naps now, and so we do rest time instead of nap time. It's a break for them and for me. You get it? And so I was talking to him, hey, we're going to go home and do rest. And Moses said, oh, like quiet time? Do the timer. So he loves it too. Listen, these spiritual disciplines are impactful if we do them. And hopefully, as we keep hearing lessons on Sunday nights, we can add more and more tools to our tool belt. Tonight, Lee Allen Frost is speaking on meditation, and it's going to be a great lesson. So come back tonight. All right, let's dive in. Dive in really fast. Does anybody have a credit card? Yeah, I mean, probably most of us. Believe it or not, I think she's got a couple of my old ones. Anyway, so listen, interest. It's a weird subject, right? It's not usually something you plan for a Sunday morning. So, hey, let's talk about interest. What's interesting about this, though, is charging interest, the act of charging interest, has been viewed as a sin, a punishable, separate you from God kind of sin for the majority of Christian history. Like, you don't have to go back too terribly far. I know I'm going to be conservative here and say certainly the 1500s, people still believed solidly that charging interest was a thing a Christian should not do, a person should not do. It was a sin that would separate you from God. Dante, in his famous poem, did you know Dante's Inferno was a poem? Yeah. Me either. It's brilliant. Anyway, Dante, in his famous work on Paradiso and Purgatorium and Inferno, he had a specific circle of hell reserved for people who charged interest. Dante wrote in like the 1300s. That gives you an idea. For 1,300 years after Jesus, the predominant thought of interest was that it was a sin and that there was, in Dante's imaginary world, which that's how he believed it. He didn't actually think hell was going to look like this. It was symbolic. But in Dante's imaginary hell, there was an actual circle. I believe it was the 7th level, and the 3rd circle of hell was reserved for people who charged interest, which also is called usury. And so he said that he believed that usury, or the making money from money without labor, violates both art and nature, which are given their gifts of God, and so it violates God and art and nature to make money from money without work. Usurers, or people who charge interest, were forced to sit, in Dante's book, forced to sit on burning sand under fiery rain. Okay, so it's not like a little one, right? This was a big one. They were constantly flicking away flames, symbolizing their torment, and each was meant to wear a money bag around their neck, marked with their family crest, a symbol of their obsession with wealth. Like, do you see what I'm trying to get at here? If you pluck someone out of 1500s Christianity and drop them into our world today, they would be appalled at our system, okay? Because truthfully, most of our world runs on interest. Most of our economy functions because of interest. Most of us are involved in interest in some way or another. Most of us aren't charging the interest. Normally we're getting charged with the interest, but still, it's a major component of our world. If we just tomorrow decided, well, we're not going to charge interest anymore as a country, we're done with it, we'd be pretty well done as a country too. It would collapse the foundations of our economy because it's such an integral part of our world. Okay, so that's bizarre. If someone from 1,000 years ago stepped into our world and saw how the relationship that we have with interest, it would be somewhat similar to us stepping into a country that believed polygamy was just how things happen, right? It's appalling. It would be off-putting. It would be like, how can you not see that Christians shouldn't be participating in this? So something happened, right? Somewhere along the lines, we changed our mind and we said, interest isn't that bad. In fact, a Christian could probably work at a bank in good conscience. We would all pretty well say at this point. So what happened, right? What happened? Were they right or were we right? Did we figure something out that just those poor ignorant people of the past didn't understand? Or were the poor ignorant people of the past far wiser than we give them credit for? Something's going on, right? We've got an issue here with the way people believed this used to be a sin and the way we now view charging interest, okay? We're not going to dive into the answer right now because in order to understand all of this, we've got to do a little bit of legwork. We got to understand, first of all, why people thought this was a sin in the first place. This goes back to two main passages in the Old Testament, or in specifically the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy. These two passages come from Exodus 22 and Leviticus 25. In essence, they say simply, don't charge other Israelites interest. The end. I mean, that's pretty much the gist of the commandments. And for a long time, that's exactly the way these commandments were understood. Don't charge interest to other Israelites. That's it. And there was a bit of a gray area. So can I charge the Romans interest? Oh, let's debate. But what was sure was you don't charge other Israelites interest. And so that was the way that worked, and that got passed down on and on and on. All of the apostles seem to have taken that stance. It was passed on to the early church fathers. It was passed on all the way through. You're going to have an impossible time finding someone who doesn't think interest is sinful until after the 1500s. And they pointed right to a Bible verse that proved it. Because it says, don't charge interest. Yeah, but to fellow Israelites. You see, there's something else going on, right? Because pretty quickly we would say, yeah, but that's the old law, and we're not under that law. And apparently it took people over 1,500 years to figure that out, that we weren't under the old law. That's possible, but Paul is pretty adamant about not being under the old law in 63 AD, or whenever Galatians was written, right about there. So that's probably not it. There's something else going on here. It has to do with how we understand the old law to function. How does the old law work? What is it supposed to do for us? Maybe another way to ask, what kind of tool is the old law? What are we supposed to do with all these weird cleanliness laws and sacrifices? Okay, well, here we go. Psalm chapter 1 says, blessed is the man who meditates on God's law day and night. Okay? So the psalmist looked back at the law and said, it's not as simple as do this and don't do this. In fact, there's some kind of meditation that has to happen on the law. I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but we'll try and recap shortly. The word for meditation, the Hebrew word, is the word hagah, H-A-G-A-H, hagah. And it is the same word to describe a lion growling while it chews on a bone. It's a word that describes a low, constant grumbling or purring or growling. The image that you're supposed to have with that word is blessed is the man who lowly mutters the law to himself day and night. This doesn't mean memorizes the law. This means meditates on the law. And those are different. Meditates on the law has more of a connotation of questioning and thinking about and chewing on and going over and asking why and asking how people have done this. Meditate on the law is what the psalmist says we're meant to do. It's also, what Jesus does, but we'll get to that in 1 second. Two things about the law that I think are really important. Paul, in Galatians chapter 3, describes the law, depending on your version, you're going to have a lot of different words there, but he describes the law as the ESV calls it guardian. I believe the King James calls it schoolmaster. The word there, the Greek word, is pedagogue, which is not a word we use much, but is an actual English, like we use it in English sometimes. It's the person who was a servant in the house who was in charge of essentially the parenting and upbringing of the children. They were the one who taught the kids how to be a functioning member of society, right? Here's how you pay your taxes. Here's how you sip your soup. Here's how you enter a room. Here's how you respect a host. Here's how you do math. Here's how you learn science. Like, this was the pedagogue's job. And Paul describes the law as our pedagogue, as our guardian, as our governor, as our teacher, as our parent. All of these are kind of cornering the idea that Paul is getting at. So there's something about the law that is supposed to be teaching us, okay? So Romans 15 says that the law, things written in former times, were written for our learning. Okay, so we're supposed to be learning from this. Tell me honestly, how does don't charge fellow Israelites interest help me? Right, that's a weird one. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It feels very much like either you do this or you don't do this. And I don't have fellow Israelites being a Gentile and whatnot, so I don't really know how that is going to work. But everyone in the Bible seems to think that there is immense wisdom in the law. So what are we supposed to do here? We're supposed to meditate on the law day and night. Let me use an example. Two examples, one illustration and one from the scripture. I heard a guy talking about his first job at Burger King. He said, he got a job at Burger King, and what do you do at Burger King but flip burgers, right? He said, when I got there, they gave me a checklist of exactly what to do in every scenario that I found myself in. The messaging was very clear, he said. He said, just do, don't think, right? Because honestly, when you arrive at a Burger King, you are not a chef, right? Like, you might be flipping burgers, you might be cooking things, but you're not a chef. You're a cog in a machine, okay? You're a piece of the assembly line. You're not meant to crisp up the burger a little bit because you like it better with a little extra. You're not meant to ask the drive-through person how well they'd like their burger cooked. You are meant to just do, don't think. That makes sense? Okay. But here's the truth of the matter is, if the Burger King manager made you a list that was extensive, exhaustive, every situation you'll ever encounter, it'd be too big to memorize. And so while they give you a list of just do, don't think, very quickly you realize, well, there's going to be a little bit of thought. Not everything was outlined exactly, and so I'm going to have to put a little bit of effort into this. And the longer you work at Burger King, the more you realize this is where the thought comes in. This is why I was given this checklist at the beginning. Sometimes things fall outside of the checklist, but if I understood the checklist, then I'll be able to apply it to these other things. You grow, right? You mature. You learn. You become more and more wise at your Burger King job. This is not any different in any other job. When you begin a sales job, you get a script. As you get better at sales, you learn how to and when it's appropriate to go off script. Like at any job, they start you with training wheels in the hopes that you grow into someone who is able to think and do better. The old law is meant to function more like that than a checklist of do's and don'ts. It is a checklist, but it's a checklist with the intent of pushing you towards maturity and wisdom, okay? So again, a biblical example of this where it happens even within the law itself. There's a law I believe it's in Exodus, about inheriting land. And it says that when a father passes, his son will inherit the land. And if he has no sons, then his nephew will inherit the land, or something to that effect. Well, and then in Numbers chapter 27, there are some daughters, and their dad dies, and they come to Moses, and they're like, that doesn't seem right. We should be able to inherit the land. And Moses says, yeah, no problem. I'll go ask the big guy. And he marches back up the mountain, and he asks God, and God says, yeah, that's fair. Let them inherit the land. And so the law actually changes within the law, which is a really interesting dynamic of our very dynamic old law. So it's not just a checklist, but it is something that is meant to push you towards maturity, towards wisdom, by your interaction with it. This is not, I'm not pulling this out of nowhere. This is what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount. Look at Matthew chapter 5. Look at Matthew chapter 5. This is exactly what Jesus does. But the fun part is he doesn't really show his work. He doesn't really tell you how he gets to where he's going. He just says in verse 21, he says, you have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to the judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Okay, so Jesus starts with the law, which is plain as day. It says, don't murder. And he says, you've heard it said, don't murder, but I'm telling you, don't even be angry. Jesus, how in the world did you get from don't murder to don't be angry? Well, option number one, you say, we don't need to follow the law anymore. It doesn't matter. Well, 6 verses, 2 sentences previous, he said, I didn't come to get rid of the law. I came to fulfill it. So I'm not telling you that's not important. I'm telling you there's more here than you have mind. All right? Dig a little deeper. And so then he does it for us. He says it's not about murder, it's about anger. How do we get from murder to anger? Well, the answer is meditation. If it's a checklist, confusion, right? I don't know how you go from murder to anger. But if it's meditation on God's law, if it's engagement in the text, if it's questioning and challenging and pushing and pulling and wrestling with God's law, well, we can get there pretty quickly. Let's just ask a few questions for him. Let's try and show Jesus' work, if you will. Well, what precedes murder? Usually hatred. Well, what precedes hatred? Usually anger. So if I don't get angry, then I won't murder. That seems pretty reasonable. Okay, well, let's think about it this way. If murder is taking of life, was it mine to take in the first place? Who gave life? Well, this goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 in creation. God is the giver and the taker of life. It's his to give and to take, not mine. So there's don't murder. Why don't murder? Because it's not my life to take. Okay, well, if it's not my life to take, then is it my life to hate? You very quickly, after asking a few questions, realize that don't murder is a starting point for children, because you can do a lot of hurt to somebody without murder. But as you ask questions and you wrestle with the text and you push back and forth and you engage, you realize anger, hatred, violence, and murder, it's a sequence of events. And we really don't have the right to be angry with somebody because we're not their master. God is. So why shouldn't I be angry? Well, okay, because Jesus said so, sure, but I shouldn't be angry because I'm not any man's master. And what's been done to me pales in comparison into what's been done for me. Wisdom is where this is pushing us, rather than a checklist. Jesus does it with the law here with murder, and he does it with several others. We're not going to go through all of them, but let's just look at one more. He says in verse 27, you have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. All right, we got another. You've heard it said, but I say unto you. And what's interesting is, like we've already pointed out, you've heard it said by God in the law, right? But I say unto you. Well, Jesus isn't superseding God's law. He's not abolishing the law. He is fulfilling it. How do you get from adultery to lust? what leads to adultery. You can see a lot of these are things that are upstream of the problem or the commandment. But you also see that the devaluing of someone to just what they can do for you, that becomes a really big problem. When you lust, when you take without asking, well, what you're really doing is you are saying this person is of lower value. I'm allowed to take what I want from them. Like you run into reasons why not to lust that are not, do not commit adultery. But do not commit adultery is your don't think, just do. That's where you start. And as we wrestle with that commandment, why not? Well, what is adultery? How have people practiced this in the past? What have smart people said about this, and what have some dumb people said about this? They're right every now and then, too. Exhibit A. Listen, how do I do this? Well, then you get to don't lust pretty quickly. Jesus got there for us. And if you ask, go further. Meditate on Jesus' commandment here. Why don't lust? Well, then you have even more understanding of the value and the inherent value of a human to God. He goes on and he does this with divorce. He does this with oaths, letting your yes be yes and your no be no. He does this with retaliation, and he does it with loving your neighbor as yourself. Jesus does this 6 different times. You've heard it said to those of old, but I say unto you. Now, what I think would be really cool is if Jesus just ran through the entire law with a you've heard it said to those of old, but I say unto you. It'd be pretty neat if he did it with all 611 or 613 commandments, and he just set it out there for us. But he doesn't. He does it with 6 of them. But he does it in a way that gives us the tools to do it with other passages. So let's take this understanding of meditating on God's law and see if we can apply it to charging interest. Should we charge it? Should we not? Is it a sin? Is it not? Let's look at our verses in question, okay? Exodus chapter 22 and verse 25. It says, if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Well, like we said, that's about the gist of it. That's as plain as it gets. When you lend money to any of my people who are my people, well, he's talking to the Israelites or the Hebrews at this time, you don't charge them interest. The end. Okay, let's look at the other passage in Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25 and verse 35 is where we'll start. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. Okay, I mean, it seems pretty clear cut. There are a couple differences in these 2 passages. One, he's talking about a fellow Israelite. The other, he's talking about sojourners. You're going to treat them like a sojourner or a stranger, which would not be a fellow Israelite. Also, you notice he doesn't say fellow Israelite in Exodus 22. He says, if you lend money to any of my people. Who are God's people? Well, have you noticed we started the wrestling match? We've just engaged the text with a question. Who are God's people? Well, right off the bat, you might think Israel. That was God's chosen people. Then you remember the nations that were promised to be blessed through Abraham, and you remember the common ancestry and how all humans came from God, and how all people are made in the image of God, and all people are God's people. So maybe this isn't just about charging Israelites interest. Maybe it's about charging anyone interest. Well, that's where we are now. That's wrestling. Round 1 is complete, and we'll move on next time we meditate. Okay, well, we're in the middle of a sermon, so this is the next time we meditate. Round 2, straight away. All right, round 2. Okay, if I'm not supposed to charge interest to anyone, why am I not supposed to charge interest? We've just engaged the text again. Another question, another important question. Okay, why are we lending people money in the first place? Well, the text says, if your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself. Let's pause real quick. Brother? So are we back at Israelite? No, I think we've ruled that out fairly substantially. This is what meditation is. It is a push and a pull. It is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It is a growth process that is hard and messy and requires a lot of effort, okay? Okay, so if your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain, okay, so I'm charging my brother interest because he doesn't have what he needs. So, okay, and then the other one, if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor. Okay, so we're talking about giving money to someone who is in need, which certainly in this context, and in a lot of cases in our context, you give money, someone borrows money because they don't have the money for what they need. That makes sense. Okay, so we're loaning money to someone who has a need, and then we're gonna charge the person who doesn't have enough money even more money to borrow our money. I'm just gonna be honest, when you say it like that, interest sounds criminal, doesn't it? It's kind of like when you get a charge on your bank account for overdrafting. I didn't have the money in the first place. You can't take any more. That's what you got mad at me for, right? Listen, this is you start to see a problem. Maybe interest really is bad, and interest is sinful. But okay, ding, 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 round 3. Why is that bad and sinful? Like, it seems reasonable if I have the commodity and someone else needs it, that I would give it to them, but I can't just give for nothing. That's a reasonable trade-off in a lot of cases. Why is it bad? Okay. You've heard it said, do not charge your brother interest. But I say unto you, don't see someone else's need as an opportunity for your gain. This is about valuing people. This is about treating other people the way that you want to be treated. This is not about interest nearly as much as it is about treating someone else like they're created in the image of God. Now, it took us a couple rounds, and maybe we expedited the process here a little bit today, but this is what the law is meant to do. It's not a legally binding do and don't. It is a list meant to push us towards wisdom, towards looking more and more like Jesus. I want to hit us with a couple of take-homes here. Couple of take-homes. The Bible very clearly wants you to engage with it. It wants you to ask questions and step into the arena and wrestle with it. The Bible wants you to be curious and wants you to wonder, why is interest wrong? I mean, listen, I don't know that you can say from the text that charging interest is evil all the time. I mean, truthfully, the way that we do it, most of the time, we're taking out a loan and getting charged interest for a thing we want rather than need. Truthfully. Okay, but the principle of seeing someone else's need as an opportunity for your gain, boy, that rings a lot more true. I have what you need, and you really need it. So I'm about to make a good living getting it from you. Like, that as a concept and as a principle is a really impactful thing in our day-to-day life. Treating people the way that we want to be treated, loving your neighbor as yourself. The Bible wants you to engage because it has these lessons of wisdom in it for you. But you don't get those quite as well if they're just told to you. The Bible has no interest in don't think, just do. The Bible has interest in think and do and wrestle with this text. Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. Paul's writing to the Romans and he says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Verse 1, I meant verse 2. Romans 12 and verse 2. Verse 1 is awesome too. All right, that's all good. Romans 12 and verse 2, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Okay, so there is some mental work that we're going to need to put in to receive some of this transformation. There is a message that is preached all over professing Christendom. Come as you are. In fact, I know a song, Come Just As You Are, right? It's a beautiful song, and it's a beautiful sentiment, but it's only half of what the Bible wants you to do. Jesus demonstrates, come just as you are. He eats with tax collectors. He eats with sinners. He spends time with prostitutes. Jesus is all up in the business of people that we would have no business with. And yet, never once does he want them to stay where they are. The message is clear. Come as you are. but I got no interest in you staying that way. The Bible wants you to be transformed by your interaction with Jesus, by your interaction with the Scripture, by your time with his family, with the body of Christ. Paul expected this transformation by the renewing of your mind. Engaging the text is one of the ways that we can be transformed. And that really leads us to this second piece of this. The Bible is one of spiritual disciplines, worship, fellowship. The Bible is one of God's agents of transformation in the hearts of his people. It's one of them. This is one of the main, you want transformation? This thing right here is how it happens. But it doesn't just happen from memorization. It happens from engagement. It happens through meditation. Like we read in Psalm 1, blessed is the man who meditates on God's law day and night. Look at how often, do this on your own time, and we've looked at some of this before, but look at how often the psalmists talk about meditating and valuing God's law and how God's law leads them to wisdom and how exciting they delight in the law of the Lord. Listen, you don't delight in checklists, but I'll tell you this, you can delight in something that gives you wisdom to life, to make you more like Jesus. I delight in things that make me more like Jesus. This is the message of this book. The Bible is an agent of transformation in the life of Christians. Jesus wants us to come as you are, but he is not interested in you staying that way. Romans 13, I think, really sums up the message that we gain from the question of interest. All right? Should you charge interest or should you not? Look at Romans 13 and verse 8. Romans 13 and verse 8, Paul says, owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. This is what this book is trying to get us to do. It's trying to get us to look and act and live more like Jesus and bring the kingdom into this dark world. If you're not a member of the church, if you are not a baptized believer in Jesus, you don't have your sins forgiven, and all of this stuff is a better way to live for you, but it's not the thing that saves you. The thing that saves you is Jesus and what he did, because he did stuff that you can't do. He lived a perfect life. He died the most unjust death that anyone could ever think of so that you could have life and experience this transformation. And if you want to take part in that, man, let us show you what it's all about. And if you need any other prayers at the church, you can come now while we stand and sing.